Both are very extensively published. They have been studying scenarios of the changes, the Middle East in transition, Islamic fundamentalism or Islamism, and obviously the politics as a whole. Mr. Tadros in particular is from Egypt, has studied Egypt extensively, but Eric is well known to us. He's worked very closely with colleagues in Kurdistan, and I think you've been here and lived here for some time. Am I right?
I've traveled here for about a decade now.
Right.
Over a decade.
Right.
I haven't yet been able to say that I've been a resident of Kurdistan.
Right, okay. Well, Eric is also an editor of current trends in Islamic ideology, and of course has published in prestigious journals across the board. I think I better leave you to introduce yourselves better than I could do, and I don't want to extend my own introduction. And over to you. The only thing to remind you is that, first of all, the first part of the talks, 10 to 15 minutes, will be recorded, will be broadcast on our website. Then the question and answers will be under Chatham House rules, no cameras, and you should feel free to chip in anytime. It's going to be a debate rather than a seminar. Eric.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Aladdin. I'm delighted to be here. As mentioned, I've been traveling here to this part of Kurdistan for over a decade now. My first trip was in 2005, and I've had the good fortune to come back basically on an annual basis for various kinds of projects and studies that I've been working on, looking at Kurdistan's development, how it connects to the other polities, Arab, Turkish, Persian, other Kurdish polities across the region. And to see the transformation of this place has been very rewarding for me. And it's one of my most favorite places to travel to in the world, certainly my most favorite in the Middle East. So it's a delight to be here. I do try to stay abreast of political and other kinds of developments here in this part of Kurdistan. And I was fortunate enough to attend the inaugural event that MERI had hosted. And ever since, I've been a regular visitor to your website, reading your various publications and paying attention to your events. So we're delighted to be here, and I hope that this can become the basis for future collaboration and exchange. It would be a real, very fortunate, real honor for me to do that. Samuel and I, my colleague at Hudson Institute, have been working on a project now for about a year and a half, which looks at what we think is the fundamental strategic dilemma in the greater Middle East. And that is the collapse or the implosion or the decomposition of the political order. There tends to be, certainly in the United States and in a lot of Western countries, a very narrow discussion about the security problems in the region. People say, well, Daesh is the biggest security threat, or Iranian expansionism is a major security threat for the vulnerable countries in the region. But Sam and I have been focused instead on the problem of state fragility or political fragility instead. And with a view toward that, we've been traveling from the farthest reaches of the Maghreb in Morocco to the Indian subcontinent and speaking with a variety of different people, religious leaders, political leaders, journalists, activists, intellectuals, analysts such as yourself, to try to understand what is causing or driving this collapse of political order, and indeed also what forces, indigenous sources exist to arrest this collapse of political order, and that we as Americans, as outsiders, can work with and collaborate over the long term to help reconstitute an order which works for the people of the region, and that reflects their own aspirations and their best hopes for themselves and their families. So A lot of what, of course, occasioned this discussion about the collapsing political order has been the events of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring revealed something about the Arabic-speaking republics in the Middle East, which many people within those republics and outside of those republics had known for a long time, and that is that they were republics in name, but not in content. As MERI's research and others have shown, these republics did not have politics that bound their societies together. And they were more or less for the last 30 years and even prior to that held together through the use of force. And the more they became insolvent politically, ideologically, economically, we saw much greater use of force being used by a variety of different despots and tyrants and others around the region with a view toward sustaining the map, which was crumbling inside. With 2011, we've seen at least 5 states and others begin to experience a deep crisis, and that crisis has been spreading. Since then, we've seen the reassertion of an older map, a map that predates the rise of the modern state-based order in many parts of the greater Middle East. It's a map, more primordial map, defined by ethnicity, defined by tribe, defined by community, defined by locality, defined by religion, and above all, as well as we know, the differences between religions or within religions. And that map has continued to assert itself with increasing force, particularly where we've seen situations where nationalism and national-based politics lose its sway. In addition to that, this sort of long tendency of sort of going small, if you will, we've seen a countervailing trend across the region, and that's been a countervailing trend to go large. And that is an effort to reconstitute the broken political order on the basis of new ideologies, many of them based upon religion. And Western analysts, and I know that analysts here in the Middle East are still struggling to try to figure out how best to analyze these movements. I think fanaticism has been a part of it, but there's also a very familiar human dimension to these efforts to go large, and that is when people are reduced to this older map of being caught in smaller polities or microstates, those are very vulnerable forms of political community. And it's only natural that people, for the interests, for their own interests, for the interests of their families, for the interests of their neighbors, would look then to the outside, to empire, to larger supranational identities, to begin to find a new kind of security which works for them. And so we've seen various efforts to recreate or to create a new kind of order on the basis of empire around the region. I think that in many respects Islamic State represents an aspiring kind of empire. An effort to recreate the broken political order on the basis of a very radical ideology and a radical teaching. I don't think it's a very attractive empire, obviously, and it needs to be destroyed. But it is certainly an aspiring empire. We've seen as well other forms of aspiring empires that have made, I think, very significant advances into places where their imperial presence had not been felt before. And here I'm thinking specifically of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has certainly since the start of the Arab Spring extended its influence into areas where it had never previously maintained much of a position, much of an influence. And as its influence has spread, instability has tended to follow. In fact, it has followed in virtually every country where Iran has expanded its presence. And I tend to think that going forward, this expansion of Iranian influence will continue to be a driver of instability in a lot of countries around the region. And I look forward to speaking about this going forward. As I mentioned, this implosion of political order, the epicenter has been in the greater Levant, in Syria and Iraq. To a certain extent, it's also affecting Lebanon and southern Turkey. But it's begun to spread as well, and we see echoes of it or assertions of it everywhere from North Africa to the Asian subcontinent. And different countries and subnational polities are struggling to sort of figure out how to deal with that. We were in Tunisia not long ago. Tunisia is making a very valiant and I think courageous effort to form a republic. It's of course the only Arabic-speaking country that made it through the Arab Spring with a viable chance of becoming a modern functioning republic. They have a long way to go. I think that they deserve the full-blown support of Western countries. But they're facing enormous problems overcoming the legacy of the Ben Ali tyranny, trying to reform their economy, trying to reform the culture of political mistrust, which Ben Ali had shaped and had made and actively shaped in an effort to maintain his tyranny for the 23 years that he was in power. Right now, however, Tunisians are not only asking questions about the future of their own country, but of course they're worried about the spread of the fighting and the warring factions that they see in nearby Libya. And of course, across North Africa, people are also asking the question, well, which state is next? A lot of people look, for example, to Algeria, a country of 40 million people, and they're anticipating a potential return, not so much to the level of instability that we saw in the 1990s with the Civil War, but certainly a period of protracted domestic stability as a consequence of the looming power struggle which will come as a result of the aging ruling elite in Algeria and its failure to replicate itself and to pass the baton, if you will, to the next generation of Algerians. The other issue, of course, that Algeria is facing is that it's a very young society. So the vast majority of Algerians had not, in fact, lived through the Civil War of the 1990s. And so they don't have that shared sense of memory of that fighting and don't participate in the same culture, sober political culture, which their parents had. And so that, I think, is a problem and will be a problem. I mention this in part because Algeria, as a fragile polity in North Africa, is a target for predatory powers, predatory movements from Al-Qaeda to Daesh. And we think that if there's going to be an international strategic response to a group like Daesh and to Al-Qaeda, it needs to focus on shoring up vulnerable polities. It needs to focus on trying to close the door, if you will, for these predatory outside powers to be able to insinuate themselves into local politics and to wreak havoc on communities. That spread doesn't only affect North Africa as well. The spreading implosion of political order doesn't only affect North Africa. It also affects the Arabian-speaking Gulf. We have a friend, a Saudi friend of mine, describes the modern Arabian political order as a poorly built brick wall. It's caving in under its own weight now because of its poor foundations. And the problem is, from an architectural viewpoint, is that the only way to fix a wall which is caving in under its weight is to break it and to rebuild it brick by brick. Now that's a 20 to 30-year project of deep cultural and political reform, which, as we know, the monarchy in Saudi Arabia and some of the more nimble and agile regimes, such as the Emirates, are making a real go of that. But as I said, that's a 20 to 30-year project, and it's a very difficult thing to pull off, even if you have a benign security environment. But right now, the Arabian political order is being pressured both by, I think, the revolutionary faction and the Iranian regime, which is trying to expand its influence into the Gulf. And as we know, it's also under pressure from Daesh. So it's facing this two-front competition. And one of the challenges, I think, for US policy and for the policy of other countries that are interested in maintaining or at least giving a fighting chance for the reformist elements in this region to preserve or to transform the political order and to create something that can be self-sustaining, needs to take that into consideration, needs to take the Arabian political order's domestic fragility and, of course, its two-front threat matrix that it's facing seriously. Here in the Greater Levant, as we know, there's been a flattening of political culture, political order more generally. And that leads us to what I think is a fundamental question. How do we begin to think about the reconstitution of a political order in this region which works for the people of the region? Samuel and I began this project on beginning with a very basic principle, very basic conceit for analysts and for public policy, and that is that security which works for people, human security, flows from responsible politics. So when you look at the map of the Greater Middle East, we can look at it freshly, and not necessarily in terms of existing borders, but rather we ask ourselves, where are the sources of responsible politics in this region? Where are the sources of politics which can show people a better future? KRG is front and center in the map of the Greater Middle East as a polity which is surely making a go of it, that's been able to withstand a lot of the pressures which have done in other vulnerable communities in the Greater Levant. Looking forward, I think, again, we work at a public policy institute in Washington, so we're trying to ask very practical questions about what U.S. policy should be toward the Greater Levant and toward this problem of reconstituting order. I myself think that the United States and other countries around the world, from our allies in the Gulf to our allies in Asia and our allies in Europe, should take an active interest in partnering with responsible polities to help to bolster them socially, politically, and economically, with a view toward building upon these foundations and with a view toward helping them help themselves to reconstitute an order which works for the people of the region. I will add, sort of in conclusion, and also before I tee up Samuel to offer some reflections on ethno-religious politics, that one of the reasons why I think KRG is so significant is that while the state-based order is being tested by all of these forces, and it's found wanting by all of these forces, it's also being tested by other forces which we can detect, we can look at. For example, demography. Some years ago, I directed a study which looked at the future of Kurdish society writ large, from the eastern Mediterranean to the western shores, the western provinces of Iran. And we gathered demographic data to the extent that we've managed to find it, from Turkish sources, from Iranian sources, also here in Iraq and in Syria. And what we found is that in Kurdish-speaking households, fertility rates are quite high. In fact, in many parts of Turkey, fertility is almost near 4. And you see similarly high fertility rates here in South Kurdistan. You see it in Iranian Kurdistan and in other places. This is happening, let me take a step back. When you look at these fertility rates, there are no straight lines in fertility, as we know. But if you carry these out into the future 20 years from now, a conservative estimate will say that there's going to be at minimum 50 million people born in Kurdish-speaking households living in the core of the Middle East. It's quite possible that it could be 60 million. Now, you can also assume that these numbers are going to come down, particularly as Kurdish society becomes more urbanized, more educated, et cetera, and I think that that's likely. But the fact of the matter is that you're having this demographic vitality in the core of the Middle East. And this is happening at a time, very interestingly, when you've seen a drop in fertility rates among the core populations which act as the political basis of the two most significant countries or two most significant states in this region. That's Turkey and Iran. In fact, the fertility amongst ethnic Turks has dropped to below, it's not quite as stark as you see in Western Europe, but it's a little bit above replacement. In Persian Shiite communities in Iran, you've actually seen the most precipitous and sharpest drop in fertility over the last 50 years in recorded history. It's particularly dropped from 1950 to 1979 as a consequence of the urbanization that we've seen in Iranian society. But then after 1979, it dropped even further, even further. not as a consequence of sociological changes, but I actually think it's entirely a consequence of the sorts of politics which have prevailed in Iranian society, and the fact that the revolutionary regime has put Iranian society on a perpetual war footing with its neighbors. And that sows fear amongst people, including the fear of bringing new children into the world. So this is happening at a time, I mean, you're seeing the collapse of these demographic regimes, the collapse of the populations in these regimes at a time when you're seeing this Kurdish vitality. And these fundamental forces are changing the deep structure of power across the greater Levant. And so that raises a very significant question. What are the politics that are going to organize these 50 to 60 million people in the greater Levant? Kurds going forward. I mean, who is going to organize them? It's clear to me as an outsider that Kurds don't want to be a part of somebody else's empire. So the question is, can the existing regimes in the region offer an equitable opportunity for Kurds to participate in their existing orders? That's going to require a Herculean effort on the part of both Turkey and Iran to transform their own political cultures in order to absorb the burgeoning Kurdish populations within their own boundaries. It requires a reinvention of Turkish ethnic nationalism, a repudiation of the many decades of Turkish ethnic nationalism which has defined Turkish republicanism, and the reinvention of the Turkish Republic from being a Turkish nation into a republic of many nations. Iran is going to have a similar sort of transformation. If you ask me, I would, and if I were to wager on this, I would say that Turkey probably has greater political capacity to do this so long as it remains a constitutional democracy. Though there are certainly very pessimistic analyses of the Turkish regime going forward, particularly under the current ruling arrangement in Turkey that says that they might not be able to pull this off. This leads me then to finally ask the question, well, how is it that here in self-governing part of South Kurdistan, what kinds of contribution can KRG make to the reinvention of politics and of republicanism going forward? I think as a self-governing polity, South Kurdistan has an enormous amount of opportunities to help be a beacon and a model for other Kurdish communities elsewhere that can provide both a softening, if you will, of the ethnic nationalism which has defined the experience of the modern nation state here in the region, and show that in fact there's a much better way forward. This is not rocket science. The inventors of modern republicanism from the early Greeks and then the rediscoverers of it in Renaissance Italy all understood that a republic is most stable, it's most viable, it's most secure if it's not based upon a limited conception of ethnicity or religion. It's right there in the inventors of modern republican thought. And I do tend to think that republics are much, much more viable, much, much more secure, much, much more stable than imperial arrangements. So with a view toward the future, part of what brings us here is to solicit your ideas about the future of Kurdish politics here in Iraqi Kurdistan. And to get a sense of how you think this part of the world will deal with the great diversity of people that live here within your current borders, and how, what kinds of governing arrangements will be best for absorbing their energies and channeling their energies so that they can continue to contribute to a regime based upon responsible politics rather than something that becomes a threat to its own people and potentially also a threat to its neighbors. With that, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Samuel, who is really an expert on ethno-religious politics and minority issues across the greater Middle East. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Samuel. I don't think I did you a lot of justice in my introduction, so feel free to blow your trumpet and talk about your Motherland Lost book that was considered the best in 2013 or something. So you know more about yourself, please.
Okay. Well, thank you for hosting me here today. And this is my first time in Kurdistan. It's a trip of learning as a scholar, but it's also a place of, or trip of discovery for me. I am Egyptian by nationality, and for all my life that I lived in Egypt, little was told to us about the lands of the Kurds. The Kurds were only a source of trouble for an Arab polity. They were people attempting to divide an Arab nation, as the discourse taught us. A pity that many of the people of the region never knew much about Kurdistan and its people. So it's a pleasure to be here to learn more than anything else about Kurdistan and its people. Let me begin by one of my favorite quotes that really captures everything that's wrong in the Middle East. Every Arabic-speaking people is an Arab people. Every individual belonging to one of these Arabic-speaking peoples is an Arab. And if he does not recognize this, and if he is not proud of his Arabism, then we must look for the reasons that have made him take the stand. It may be an expression of ignorance. In that case, we must teach him the truth. It may spring from an indifference or from a false consciousness. In that case, we must enlighten him and lead him into the right path. It may result from extreme egoism. In that case, we must limit his ego. But under no circumstance should we say, as long as he does not wish to be an Arab, and as long as he is disdainful of his Arabness, then he is not an Arab. He is an Arab, regardless of his own wishes. Whether ignorant, indifferent, undutiful, or disloyal, he is an Arab. But an Arab without consciousness or feeling, or even perhaps without conscience. I don't know if you know the author or the person who wrote these words, but it's a man who had perhaps one of the most destructive roles in this land that we are in now, and that's Sata al-Husari. One born out of a Syrian origin family in Yemen, raised as a Turk in service of the Ottoman Empire, who then becomes the key ideologue, the key thinker of Arab nationalism. Long before Michel Aflaq or Salah ad-Din al-Bitar even thought of their Arab identity and Arab nationalism, he was the man that really founded that ideology and vision. And not only as an ideologue, the man who joined Faisal in Syria in his short attempt to create a kingdom there would move to him then to the newly created kingdom of his in Iraq, where he would be made responsible for its educational system, putting these ideas, these thoughts into the minds of hundreds of thousands and millions of people who would pass through that. Where would be the Kurds in that discourse? Well, non-existent. They are Arabs, even if they don't really speak Arabic, but they will be made into Arabs, because the region is thus nothing but the land of the Arabs. Now, as that vision and those thoughts, looking at the region simply as the land of the Arabs, dominated the politics of many of those republics, if not all, that were born after the British and the French colonial powers left, they also dominated, and to an extent continue to dominate, the thought in the West, in Washington and London, in many of the places that attempt to look at this region and understand it. I was asked last year to teach a new course at Johns Hopkins, where I teach, about Arab political thought or Middle Eastern political thought. I took a look at syllabuses across various US universities, and the outline was quite simple. Napoleon came to Egypt introducing modernity. People thought, what went wrong? How can we catch up? Gamal al-Din al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu, the rise of nationalism locally, whether territorial nationalism of Lutfi Sayyid in Egypt or the birth of Arab nationalism, Antonius, the Arab revolt, all of that, and the modern rise of Islamism. Where were the minorities of the region in such a course, in such a syllabus about political thought? Where were the Kurds and the Amazigh? Where were the religious minorities? They were not there. You got a word or two about the role of Levantian Christians in the formation of Arab nationalism. Sure, that was there. But nothing about the thought of the peoples of this region. The region is often approached in Washington, in scholarship and in policy-making circles, as one dominated by Sunni Arab Muslims. Others are a source of curiosity, of sometimes interest in looking at the details of these historical communities and cultures, but they have no political implication. It is against this vision and this approach to the region that I frame my discussion today. 1400 years ago, armies marched out of the Arabian Peninsula. With them were two messages and two flags carried. One was the universal message of Islam, a religion that by its very claim and nature, the words of its prophet, did not differentiate between an Arab or Persian except by his piety. But there was another message and another flag carried by those tribes emerging from the peninsula, and that was of Arabism. They were, after all, the religion had been given to a specific people originally. Those tribes around Mecca and in the larger Arabian Peninsula who absorbed that religion and became its early defenders would dominate the way that religion is understood, spoken, and thought about for centuries. The book had been given in Arabic, that being its very miracle, the prose of that book compared to the writings of the Arabs. And it is within that Arabness that the religion would be initially formed and understood. The Umayyad Caliphate, discriminating against any of those peoples of the regions who converted to Islam and yet were not Arab. The Abbasids coming to power and offering something different, offering a kind of equality. But those two contending messages, the universal aspect, promise of Islam, and the uniqueness, the discriminatory aspect of the Arabness of it, would always be in competition and sometimes working together, sometimes fighting against each other as those societies were being built. For many of the people of the region, the tension between the two was not there. They converted to Islam and became Arab. That is the story of the majority of the people in the greater Levant, in many of the countries that the Arab tribal armies had arrived in. On the sidelines of Iraq, of Turkey, emerged another option. Islam was to be embraced, but Arabism was not. That is, of course, the story of the Persians, who accepted Islam, even over time developed a unique aspect of Islam, the Shia Twelver belief, but rejected becoming Arabs. The same is the story of Kurdistan, of the Kurdish people. Of that story, I have nothing to offer to you. As I said, I am but a student coming here to learn. So it's not my intention to discuss those communities, the ethnic part of the region, although it's fascinating to look at the stories of people like the Amazigh, or as they're referred to derogatorily as the Berbers of North Africa, and see the similarities to the Kurdish story. It is instead my intention to look at the other side of the equation. Those who accepted Arabism or who became Arabs by virtue of a long process of 1400 years but rejected Islam, i.e. those religious minorities, specifically the Copts of Egypt, from which I come, and their story. Perhaps it might be a story of interest to you as you contemplate the future of this land and what it will mean. The very word Copt, of course, is the word for Egypt. The Greek word for Egypt, Gyptus, when the Arabs came to the land, couldn't pronounce it. So instead of Gyptus, they pronounced it Qibtus. The Arabic Qibt became, when the Latins started to learn it, it became Coptus, and the word then became the English Copt. So by its very word, when we use the word Copt, we basically mean Egyptians. They're the people of Egypt. But now the term is used specifically to refer to a certain group of Egyptians, namely those who maintained their Christian faith and did not convert to Islam. Christianity had come to Egypt early on at the hands of one of the earliest disciples of Christ, St. Mark, who wrote one of the 4 Gospels. But the connection of the land of Egypt to the biblical narrative had, of course, been much deeper into history. The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, had all come to the land, escaping famine in Palestine. Moses had led his people out of that land. Jeremiah had come seeking refuge at the time of the Babylonian takeover of Judea at the time. And of course, from the Christian perspective, most importantly, Jesus himself had come, escaping persecution by King Herod, and lived in Egypt for a period of 3 to 3.5 years, according to tradition. This narrative, this pride in the connection, would form the basis of the Coptic identity. The Copts became the early champions of Christianity. The land would become known, and the Copts, as the land of the martyrs, the very Coptic calendar that is used until today, being a calendar that starts with the most powerful Roman persecution of the people. The Copts contributed a lot to early Christianity. The Church of Alexandria, by virtue, of course, of Alexandria's importance in the culture that dominated the region, the very culture that I see here in front of me hanged, this mixture of the Hellenic art with the Pharaonic scripture there, that culture is what gave birth and rise to a great Christian civilization in the country. Monasticism was born in the country at the hands of St. Anthony the Great, before it was copied across the Western world. But that community then, in 641, met Islam for the first time. The interaction, the living between both communities, is a fascinating way to look at how the region had developed. First, of course, was the question of conversion. Initially, the distinctions between Christians and Muslims were obvious. Over time, many Christians began to convert to Islam for a variety of reasons. Some of them believed in the message of that religion. Others saw it as an opportunity to belong to the ruling class. There's a variety of reasons, including assimilation, where people lived together for hundreds of years before adopting the other side's religion automatically. But conversion, which was a process that took many years, scholars believe that Egypt remained the Christian majority country until maybe the ruling of the time of Al-Hakim Ba'amr Allah al-Fatimi, the Fatimid ruler around 1000 AD. That process is only part of the story. Another aspect of it was the revolt. Many Coptic revolts, especially what was called the Bashmurian revolts, tried to kick out the Arab Muslim invaders, rulers of the country. Crushed interestingly enough, by an army emerging from Iraq that was led by the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun, who led personally his army to crush the revolt in Egypt. But also, it was a question of how do we coexist in that land? The Copts spoke a Coptic language. They maintained that language. It was the last form of the language spoken by the pharaohs, the hieroglyphic language. Over time, however, it became impossible for them to maintain it. If the Kurds succeeded miraculously, one might add, in maintaining their own language, something the Amazigh have only partially succeeded in doing, the Copts did not succeed at all. The Arabization of the Diwan, of the government offices, by the various walis of Egypt, forced the Copts who wanted to maintain, to work in service of the government, to learn Arabic. And over time, the very Coptic church realized that its people no longer understood Coptic. That in order for them to maintain their Christian faith, it was necessary for the church to start changing the language of prayers into Arabic. So by the year 1145, the church's prayers, the very liturgy, was now being performed in Arabic for a population to understand. The life of the non-Muslim minorities in the land of Islam was, of course, that of Ahlul Zimma. The formulation of they were protected and allowed minorities to exist, but also that of second-class citizenship. They were not equal. They were not allowed to carry arms. They were required to pay a specific amount of money, the jizya, in order for them as non-Muslims to exist. But they were also required to live under a set of rules developed throughout the centuries under the name of the Pact of Umar, in Arabic, Al-Uhda Al-Umariyya. These set of rules would require them to wear specific colored clothes, not to ride horses, they would only be allowed to ride donkeys, not allowed to build churches in their land. All these set of rules that required them to live as second-class citizens and a minority. Now, the world of both the ethnic minorities of the region and of its religious minorities would suddenly be shaken by a man coming from France, Napoleon Bonaparte, who would lead an army and invade Egypt. The shock of that invasion was profound in the region. When the Mamluk rulers of Egypt were informed that the French had arrived, one of the Mamluks famously said, "Let all the Franks come, and we will crush them under the hooves of our horses." The word Franks, and not Frenchmen, is an interesting word here in his usage. The Franks, he remembers, were that of the Crusades. When the Christian Europe had come invading the Middle East, yes, maintained a presence for 100, 200 years, but was eventually defeated. It is with that mindset, a mindset that viewed the success of the Ottoman Empire reaching into areas of Europe that had never met Islam. It is a success that reached the gates of Vienna twice under Ottoman armies. That would blind the people of Egypt and its rulers to the reality that something had changed. That the Franks were no longer Franks, that they had suddenly become Frenchmen. When the two armies met in the Battle of the Pyramids, as Napoleon remarked, watched by 40 centuries of history in front of those grand pyramids, it wasn't exactly the Mamluks crushing the Frenchmen or the Franks. It was the other way around. Some 5,000-6,000 Mamluks in the army were killed. Some 20 or so soldiers were lost by the French army. The shock of that discovery would, of course, give rise to all kinds of political discourse and ideas in the region. From the question that Bernard Lewis shaped, what went wrong? Why have these people advanced and we have not? What was the problem? What has pulled us back? But also the question of identity. Who are we? When an Egyptian imam is sent to Paris as part of an attempt at modernization by its ruler Muhammad Ali, the name of the imam Rifa'a Rafi' al-Tahtawi, who writes a fascinating account about his experience in Paris. He discusses for the first time the concept of wataniyya, nationalism. These Frenchmen are patriots. They're not just Christians, as we assume that all these Europeans share this common Christian identity. In fact, as he discovers, these Frenchmen are not exactly religious Christians. He, of course, goes to Paris in 1830 after the French Revolution, and during that rejection of the Age of Enlightenment and of reason and rejection of that Christian identity in Europe. But they have this idea of patriotism. Now, the lands from which he came did not know that form of nationalism. People knew a smaller or a larger form. They knew their village. People often led lives that never took them outside of their own villages. Someone was from a specific village, from Erbil, from Sulaymaniya. Or he thought of himself as belonging to the lands of Islam. He was an Ottoman subject. He was a Muslim, part of the Muslim millah, or of the Christian millah, within an Ottoman empire. That was the kind of political order that he understood. The idea that he has a specific identity, be it that of a Kurd, or an Egyptian, or that he's a Maronite, and that's a specific identity, an Armenian, all of that formation of an identity would come as a reaction to the discovery of those ideas coming from Europe. As much as the Ottoman Empire tried to modernize, it was really creating its own death. People were being sent to Europe to learn how to work the printing press, to learn how to use modern armies, but they were coming back with other things as well. They were coming back with ideas. Women's role in society. Should women be veiled or not? All that debate that emerges in those lands. The question of identity and who we are. All those ideas would lead to the shaking of the political order in the region. Suddenly the states would be modernizing, would be changing the basis of law. No longer would be Sharia the basis of the law. No longer would there be a system of millahs as the Ottoman system was done. We sometimes think of these as they are great things. People were finally being given equality. Not always were the very people given that equality thinking of it in those terms. When the Ottomans released their main reform edicts in 1856, granting all the religious minorities equality, the Greeks of Constantinople, of Istanbul, complained. You see, they had always accepted being second class to the Muslim millah. But to be equaled with the Jews, that is something they completely rejected. A letter that we still have until now, written by the leaders of the Greek community, said, we complain, we don't want this equality, a thing that is coming from Europe. We accept being second to Muslims as long as we are not equal to the Jews that are under us. So the tension for those minorities, for those people, was not only how to shape their own identity in front of a larger collective of the Ottoman identity, or of a Muslim one, or of an Arab one in the case of the Kurds, but also often to shape their very identity towards the other minorities as well. What would be that, especially in a region, of course, that had had all kinds of minorities living together. You look at the map of Lebanon today, or of Syria, and all those small communities next to each other. If there would be a rise of a Druze national identity, what would this mean for the Maronite peasants working with them? And the other way around. What it would be meaning for the Sunni merchants living in the cities on coastal Lebanon, or to the Shiite minority in the south. All that tension would emerge. The promises, of course, of liberation, of independence of the colonial powers were sold to the people of the region as a promise of liberation for everyone. We would get rid of the British, of the French, and finally have our own land where we would all be equal. The reality has been anything but. The reality has both been a dictatorship, a small minority of army officers often, or of ideologues of a particular party that rule the country on their own, or the reality of the suppression of religious and ethnic diversity. No longer are the Kurds allowed to speak their own language under Saddam's Iraq, or in Bashar or his father's Syria. No longer would the Assyrians be allowed to express their identity. All of that was crushed under a homogeneous worldview that viewed identity as a hat. You could only wear one at a time. You could not be a Kurd, Arab, Christian, combination of them, and Iraqi at the same time. You had to be one or the other. Any expression of a Coptic identity is thus viewed as a threat to Egyptianness. Any expression of a Kurdish uniqueness and culture is thus a threat that Iraq has to suppress. It is that vision that dominated the region since its independence. And it is with that vision that I end my discussion today. Today, Kurdistan is at a historical crossroads. For the first time, the Kurds have a chance that they haven't had in 100 years. In fact, in a very much longer time. And that is to be the masters of their own land, to build their own country. But on what foundation is that country to be built? Are we to see a repetition of the failures of the Arab states all around them? If the land will only be a national state of a particular group, are the people that have been suppressed for hundreds of years going to suppress the others? Or is Kurdistan going to be a different land? Is it going to be a beacon of light in the middle of an extremely depressing region all around you? That challenge lies in front of you. That promise and option of a bright future lies in front of you. I started with a quote, so let me end with one. It is President Reagan famously quoted from a Jewish rabbi from the 1st century about if not us, who, if not now, when. The words became very famous in the times of the Cold War. But another part of that quotation is fascinating as we think about the future. It is, if I am not for myself, then who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, then what am I? Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Fascinating. I'm normally much more strict than this when chairing, but I was really fascinated. I didn't want to interrupt such a wonderful display of history, evolution of this place, and the analogies you draw between the different minorities and nations as well as religious groups.